Our planet is getting hotter. The climate is going haywire, and few still doubt the impact of human influence over this predicted catastrophe.
L'homme, en quelque sorte, joue aux apprentis sorciers.
Global warming is a daily reality for the inhabitants of this planet, and the scientific community as a whole is rallying to try and avoid its most dramatic consequences.
Those activities which are emitting carbon dioxide are obviously imposing a cost on the Earth, on humanity, on this generation and the next generation.
CO2 is a major concern, and should global warming continue at its current rate, it could well transform the Earth into an increasingly inhospitable environment.
Le premier coupable, l'ennemi public numéro 1, si vous voulez, c'est bien le CO2.
Will mankind succeed in reducing its emissions of carbon dioxide? And at what cost? Can the international community avoid the worst? And what if global warming represented an opportunity for the future of our planet?
Global warming is right here. I mean, instead of having a frozen ocean, a frozen seashore, we've got water. Instead of snow, we're getting rain. So we're dealing with the effects of global warming right now.
October 2004. A gale is blowing north of the Arctic Circle on the island of Kivalina. The late arrival of ice means that nothing remains to protect the fragile strip of sand from the assaults of the ocean. Dozens of meters of sand are carried away, and waves flood the streets of Kivalina. 400 Eskimos have to flee the land of their ancestors to avoid being swallowed up by the sea. The UN believes that 150 million individuals will be pushed into exile before the end of this century because of the rise of sea levels. Michel Jarraud, Secretary General to the World Meteorological Organization, presents the press with the last yearly report on climate change produced by the WMO. During a speech made at the UN headquarters, Michel Jarraud confirmed that the planet is indeed warming up and explained that 2008 was among the warmest years of the last century and a half. Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, cataclysmic floods in Asia and Europe, increase in the number of heat waves in the south, or of cold waves in the north. The UN report blames global warming for most natural disasters around the world.
Vous vous souvenez peut-être de cette vague de chaleur qui a affecté la France et l'Europe de l'Ouest en 2003. C'était quelque chose qui à l'époque était quand même exceptionnel. Eh bien ce genre d'événement deviendra beaucoup plus fréquent avec le réchauffement climatique. Donc le réchauffement entraînera un accroissement de la fréquence et ou de l'intensité d'un certain nombre de ces phénomènes.
Something fundamental may have been disrupted at the heart of our climate system.
Le premier coupable, l'ennemi public numéro 1, si vous voulez, c'est bien le CO2, parce que c'est lui dont l'augmentation n'a cessé de se produire et qui est donc, je dirais, l'agent le plus préoccupant pour le changement climatique futur.
story begins long before man ever set foot on the Earth. All living molecules are made of carbon, which is the key element of life. The carbon is released by animals and plants when they die and decompose, and is then reintroduced into forests and oceans. It continuously circulates between these different reservoirs and the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, CO2. This is what scientists call the carbon cycle. But over billions of years, enormous reserves of carbon have been trapped deep in the Earth.
C'est lui le fameux carbone fossile. En fait, il est fossile parce qu'il a vraiment été formé, je sais pas, du temps des dinosaures, bien avant, et on le retrouve dans les gisements, dans les poches de charbon, dans les gisements de pétrole, et puis aussi dans les gisements de gaz naturel. Et avant l'intervention, avant la révolution industrielle, ce carbone fossile, il avait absolument aucun échange, c'était vraiment deux mondes séparés, avec le cycle du carbone naturel formé par la végétation, l'atmosphère et les océans.
The Industrial Revolution is going to change everything. Man opens Pandora's box to develop his industry and multiply his means of transport. He burns coal, petrol and gas, and destroys the forests to harvest ever-increasing areas of land. Drawing on fossil carbon reserves that had been buried in the mists of time, man releases more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Donc ce qu'on fait, c'est qu'on change vraiment la quantité totale de carbone qu'on met dans le système. Avant, il y avait juste l'atmosphère, l'océan et la végétation, et après, il y a l'atmosphère, l'océan et la végétation, plus la partie du carbone qui nous vient de cette boîte, de ce réservoir de carbone fossile. Cette partie qui reste dans l'atmosphère, ça rajoute de l'effet de serre, ça rajoute en quelque sorte des couvertures sur l'ensemble qui existait déjà.
The greenhouse effect, this wonderful process which is going to become a nightmare in just a few decades. The sun's rays warm up our planet, and in return, our planet sends back infrared rays into space. This great quantity of heat would be lost forever if various gas components did not form a blanket around the globe to retain it. These gases are the greenhouse effect gases, such as methane, water vapor, and mainly CO2.
En soi, cet effet de serre naturel, c'est plutôt une bonne chose. Parce qu'on n'aurait pas de CO2 dans l'atmosphère, on n'aurait pas de gaz à effet de serre. La température de notre planète, elle serait beaucoup plus froide que celle qu'on connaît actuellement. Elle serait à peu près 33 ou 34 degrés plus froide. Donc on a vraiment une terre glaciale que la température actuelle, qui en moyenne sur le globe est de l'ordre de à peu près 18 degrés Celsius.
However, man's emission of ever-increasing amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere is going to shatter this fragile equilibrium. Just a few milligrams of extra CO2 for each kilo of air are enough to increase the quantity of greenhouse gases. These quantities involved are so minute that they are calculated as parts per million. This tiny difference is going to accelerate the global warming of our planet at a rate without precedent.
Au moins au cours du dernier demi-million d'années, voire un peu plus, le CO2 a jamais dépassé cette borne supérieure qui est de 280 ppm. Et ici, en fait, c'est la valeur actuelle du CO2. On est à peu près à 360 ppm. C'est-à-dire qu'on est en climat chaud et on a augmenté le CO2 d'à peu près 100 ppm au-dessus de la valeur la plus haute qu'il a jamais connue pour tous les climats chauds, au moins du dernier million d'années.
You are most welcome to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. This is Svante Arrhenius.
100 years ago, this Nobel Chemistry Prize winner had predicted the crucial role of CO2.
Theoretically, he was aware of the fact that if we continue to burn coal, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere might increase and causes global warming. He viewed it as a positive thing, and he actually said that might improve living conditions in harsh environments as we have in Sweden, particularly during the winter. So he was aware of this issue, but I don't think he really believed that it would happen.
We will be tasking for a few moments, so please remain seated.
In the absence of proof, Svante Arrhenius' theories went unheeded for a long time. On the slopes of the world's biggest volcano, the Mauna Loa, in this observatory built at an altitude of 10,000 feet, John Barnes and his colleagues are measuring the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere.
We know CO2 would be higher in cities and other kinds of pollution. We really want to measure the whole globe. And when we measure it here, the level of CO2 is really representing a huge area of the Pacific. So we know it's not just a local influence.
It is here that for the first time, an American oceanographer has been able to measure an unusual rise in the levels of CO2 present in the atmosphere, and to draw a curve which has now become famous, the Keeling curve.
Charles David Keeling started the measurement back in 1958 here at Mauna Loa. And as you can see, just in the first year, it was ramping up. And you can see that it's gone up every year and that the increase is getting faster. And the increase can really only be explained by man-made activities.
Half a century will have to pass, however, before the scientific community could come up with an explanation for this breathtaking rise. Dr. Rajendra Pachauri, Nobel Peace Prize winner in 2007, is the president of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC brings together 2,500 scientists of many nationalities, and their report of 2007 shattered the prevailing dogmas.
Unless there is support, unless there's momentum from the people of every society. Carbon dioxide is the cause behind climate change, and therefore those activities which are emitting carbon dioxide are obviously imposing a cost on the earth, on humanity, on this generation and the next generation. So we have to do something to control the way human beings are emitting greenhouse gases. Otherwise, in the 21st century, the changes will be much worse than what we saw in the 20th century.
Svante Arrhenius was right. Once a month, Christian Vincent and his students ski away from their glaciology lab to monitor the evolution of some of the glaciers of the Mer de Glace. Their program includes core drilling and the installation of beacons at more than 10,000 feet to study the melting and the recession of these valleys of ice.
Si on prend la tendance à long terme, depuis 1850, le glacier de la mer de glace a reculé d'environ 2 km. Sur ces 15 dernières années, le glacier a reculé de 450 mètres.
Scientists observe the melting of ice around the globe, an unquestionable proof that global warming is indeed speeding up.
Les glaciers montrent une tendance très négative avec une perte de masse très marquée et ça traduit directement le réchauffement.
In the basements of the Toulouse Centre of Météo France, a host of computers is building up all sorts of forecasts on the climate of tomorrow and beyond. The results are scenarios of rapid climate change, to which man will find it very difficult to adapt.
Actuellement, d'après les émissions qui ont pu être relevées au cours des 10 dernières années, on sait qu'on se situe sur le scénario le plus haut qui a été imaginé par le GIEC. C'est donc un scénario à très forte émission qui, s'il se produisait, pourrait conduire donc à la partie haute de la fourchette, donc approcher les 5 à 6 degrés de réchauffement suivant les modèles et suivant les projections.
5 to 6 degrees Celsius. This increase of temperatures could well upset the carbon cycle and drag our climate into the unknown. Corinne Lequerret is a world specialist on carbon sinks, a mechanism through which nature absorbs the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere.
One very important thing is that of all the CO2 that is emitted to the atmosphere from fossil fuel emission and deforestation, only 45% remain in the atmosphere, and that's because of the presence of 2 very large sinks, the ocean sink and the terrestrial biosphere sink.
These sinks work like CO2 vacuum cleaners. They balance and regulate our climate. Welcome into the world of the very tiny. Diatoms, dinoflagellates, cyanobacteria, these are some of the species of phytoplankton, microscopic algae which constitute part of an extraordinary deep-sea flora and activate the biological pump. Micro-seaweeds which live by the billions on the surface of the oceans and consume CO2 like the leaves of a tree, thanks to photosynthesis. The food chain takes care of the rest. Once the carbon has been fixed in the cells of the algae is eaten by fish or zooplankton, and when their droppings sink to the seabed, the carbon is returned to the depths of the ocean. An amazing biological mechanism which constitutes the biggest reserve of carbon in the ocean.
S'il n'y avait pas de pompe biologique dans l'océan, il y aurait actuellement 2 fois plus de carbone dans l'atmosphère. C'est-à-dire qu'un océan non vivant, ça serait un effet de serre beaucoup plus important. Donc la pompe biologique est vraiment un processus fondamental pour soustraire du CO2 à l'atmosphère, et on estime que c'est de l'ordre de 90%, les 10% restants étant faits par la pompe dite physique.
Salinity, air temperature, water density. A delicate balance which allows the ocean to capture and dissolve the CO2 of the atmosphere and to send it to the ocean floor using the deep dives mechanism. This is what is called the physical pump. The major deep dives are located in the cold seas of Greenland and Norway and in the Indian Ocean. Vast quantities of CO2 are taken to the seafloor and stay there for thousands of years, caught by the deep currents which cover the sea depths. Just outside Montpellier, the green oaks of the forest of Puy-Chabot hide more than just a few wild boar. Passers-by may well discover an astonishing installation. An impressive series of captors installed at the feet and at the tops of trees, which have for some years now allowed us to study the slightest heartburn of these CO2 big eaters.
La forêt contribue à baisser les taux de CO2 dans l'atmosphère parce qu'elle absorbe du CO2 par le processus de photosynthèse, qui est simplement un processus d'accumulation du CO2. Ça se fait dans les feuilles. Et ça permet à l'arbre d'accumuler du carbone et de grandir.
Very much like the pores of our skin, tree leaves hide minute holes called stomas, which allow them to absorb and store CO2 and to feed on it. Thanks to this biochemical reaction and to the decomposition of the forest soils, forests around the globe, the biosphere, become carbon sinks capable of absorbing nearly 30% of the CO2 present in the atmosphere. Photosynthesis, deep dives, carbon sinks, this amazing machinery is at the center of all life on our planet, and it could well become jammed by the effects of global warming.
In the North Atlantic, CO2 sink, which is very intense because of a lot of biological activity, appears to be now reducing and possibly, yes, saturating over some period. On land, we can talk about real saturation because the CO2 sink on land could stop if the fertilization by CO2 stops, and also it could even reverse and start putting its carbon to the atmosphere.
This could reduce the efficiency of the natural carbon cycle by 5 to 30%.
If the two sinks become weaker because of climate change, then the result will be that less CO2 will be absorbed by these two sinks, thus it will stay in the atmosphere and cause more warming. And the estimates at the moment is 0.1 to 1 and up to 1.5 degree more warming by the end of this century.
During the 2003 heatwave, the process of photosynthesis was disturbed. A certain number of European forests actually started to reject more CO2 than they were absorbing, and thus became sources of CO2. Hence the idea to build this giant umbrella to exclude rainfalls and to study the consequences of a multiplication of droughts.
L'inquiétude, c'est si le climat change, c'est-à-dire si la température augmente et si les sécheresses deviennent de plus en plus importantes, les arbres vont absorber moins de CO2 de l'atmosphère. Donc, le CO2 dans l'atmosphère va augmenter, l'effet de serre va augmenter, le climat va changer de plus en plus. Donc c'est un cycle qu'on appelle un effet rétroactif.
To put it another way, the hotter it gets, the hotter it will continue to get. The only way out is to limit the increase of temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius to avoid becoming helpless in the face of climate change.
The 2 degree is a compromise. Now, the response of the Earth to global warming is in many ways gradual, but there are some important thresholds. And one of the most important thresholds is the degree at which the Greenland ice sheet will melt. And this, we think, is somewhere between 2 and 4 degrees globally. So 2 degrees actually gives a relatively fair chance that this is not exceeded. And there is about 5 to 7 meters of sea level stuck in the Greenland ice sheet, so that's very important.
At the foot of the Colorado Mountains, in a dark room of the NOAA, the American Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, sits a strange machine, the carbon tracker. This machine allows us to visualize our carbon emissions for any given year, and what we see is staggering. Flames of CO2 actively consuming our planet.
The aim of Carbon Tracker is not to spy on governments or people. The aim is to help people and governments to reduce emissions. Because once the observing system is as good as we hope we can make it, we want to give objective feedback on what is working and what is not working. And I think ultimately we all need to know that. So here we are in the lab where we receive the samples from all over the world. For example, in these boxes are our airplane samples. And here you see boxes that have the samples that come from places really all over the world. So for example, this one comes from Lampedusa Island, a part of Italy. This box comes from Christmas Island, which is a small island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
These bottles of compressed air have been collected by weather stations, by planes or by ships. They allow us to quantify the level of greenhouse gases of more than 24,000 samples. The inventory does not cover the entire globe as yet, but it is continuously growing.
We expect that very soon we will be in a global regime whereby every country in the world is starting to make promises that they will be reducing emissions. And of course that is going to cost a lot of money. I mean, I'm talking trillions of dollars per year, enormous amounts, because we need to reform our entire energy system.
Although he looks like an eternal student, Dimitri Zengelis is in fact one of the most talented economists of his generation. He teaches at the prestigious London School of Economics and is one of the main authors of the Stern Report, named after the ex-vice president of the World Bank. The report estimates that the cost of global warming will reach $5,500 billion.
The main conclusion is simply this: the costs of action are dramatically lower than the costs of inaction, and the costs associated with delay are very, very high. Every year, every month that we do not act, the stock of greenhouse gases increases, and therefore the work we need to do to meet any temperature level in terms of emissions, that's the flow into greenhouse gases, goes up. You know, these gases sit in the atmosphere for 10, maybe hundreds of years. So every year that we put more, we actually have a harder work and a higher starting point to address this problem from.
In 2006, this Stern Report was a turning point for all concerned. For the very first time, global warming wasn't just a mere danger for the ecology of the planet, it was also threatening its economy.
At least over the next few decades, something like 1%, perhaps 2% of GDP would need to be devoted to addressing the most significant risks associated with climate change.
To put it another way, acting now against global warming would be 20 times less expensive than doing nothing.
Why is it so cheap? Well, a lot of the technologies already exist. By various estimates, we could do between a quarter and half of the reductions in emissions simply by taking steps to improve efficiency in energy generation and distribution, efficiency in consumption, efficiency in buildings, efficiency in transport.
No, we didn't come here to meet José Manuel Barroso, the media-friendly president of the European Commission, but Stavros Dimas, the European Environment Commissioner. Since 2004, Stavros Dimas has been in charge of the difficult program on European reduction of emissions of carbon dioxide. A challenging task indeed for a man who decided that Europe would set the example for the rest of the world.
The European Union has taken the leadership in fighting climate change. We exercised a lot of pressure and a lot of efforts in order to put in force the Kyoto Protocol.
Kyoto was a first step taken in the land of the rising sun. In December 1997, 141 countries promised to sign the Kyoto Protocol, with the notable exception of the United States. They committed themselves to a reduction of 5.2% of worldwide carbon dioxide emissions based on the 1990 figures. A reasonable objective, which Europe was soon to overtake.
The European Union has a collective target of reducing by 8% its greenhouse emissions. And we are on the way to achieving this target. And by the year 2012, which is the deadline, we are going to overshoot this target.
Not everyone decided to follow Europe in its wish to be top of the class. Eric Schäfer is a renegade. In 2004, the former director of the National Agency for the Protection of the Environment in the United States slammed the door and left the agency.
They're very friendly to the coal and oil industry, and the lobbyists in Washington went to the White House behind me and said, you need to get the EPA to stop doing what they're doing. And eventually the White House told us, you need to pull back.
So you decide to quit?
Yeah, what can you do? You're supposed to enforce the law. You're not allowed to enforce the law. I left.
Now director of the Environment Integrity Project, Eric Schäfer keeps bringing lawsuits against the big companies in the energy sector. One of his favorite targets is the Morgantown coal power plant on the banks of the Potomac River, which, like hundreds more in the United States, releases excessive amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year.
We get half our electricity from plants like that one, and they are an enormous source of carbon dioxide emissions, maybe 35% of the carbon dioxide emissions in the U.S. from plants like the one behind me. You know, we have to find something else, you know? This is the fuel for the last century. You know, it's done its job, and we need to move on.
Together with China, the United States has the biggest reserves of coal in the world, billions of tons buried under the surface, just waiting to go up in smoke. And these two countries happen to produce the largest amount of emissions of CO2, far more than Europe and the rest of the world put together. In the country of business opportunities, the new golden egg is the selling of carbon coupons to allow individuals to offset their emissions of carbon dioxide. This is what bioengineering proposes, a large-scale manipulation of the environment to solve the issue of global warming. Giant space mirrors, injection of sulfur into the atmosphere, ice cubes in the ocean, or fertilization of the oceans. To achieve this, a lot of imagination is needed, and a bit of science.
If we just took one or two of these containers and put it on each ship and used the contents of that container as the ship was crossing the oceans to replenish the iron that's gone missing from the oceans, and in doing so restore the ocean pastures, the ocean forest, then the ocean plants would take care of at least half of the problem of humanity's carbon dioxide. And in doing so, it would restore the ocean, and we would have more seafood, and it would be very inexpensive compared to the cost of the shipping of goods.
Je pense que d'une certaine façon, c'est jouer avec le feu parce qu'on n'a aucune idée, ni de l'efficacité, ni des effets secondaires. Donc dans ce sens-là, c'est jouer avec le feu. C'est probablement aussi jouer avec le feu parce que laisser percevoir l'idée qu'on va pouvoir résoudre le problème du changement climatique et notamment de l'augmentation du CO2 par une technique quelle qu'elle soit, ça peut-être empêche de prendre conscience pleinement que l'enjeu, c'est la réduction des gaz à effet de serre, du CO2 et des autres. Et ça, c'est aussi un des dangers de la géo-ingénierie, c'est de détourner en fait l'attention du public, des politiques, de cette idée qui est l'idée majeure et sans laquelle on ne s'en sortira pas, c'est la réduction des émissions de CO2.
The scientific community is unanimously opposed to such commercial manipulation of the ocean, which could result in an increase of its acidity and kill all the sea life in the area. The atmosphere is very relaxed in this first European press conference by Todd Stern, President Obama's recently appointed envoy on climate change. A sweet taste of revenge for this former American Kyoto negotiator who decided to resign when the Bush administration refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol.
There certainly are some years that are lost because of the policies of the Bush administration, which was not they were not so interested in trying to make rapid progress on this issue. On the other hand, I think we are definitely committed to making up for lost time. The president has put forward very ambitious efforts, both at home on the domestic side. And with respect to what we're trying to do in the negotiations for Copenhagen. So you can't get back the lost years, but you can't try to make up for lost time.
And along with the cap and trade program I've proposed, we'll reduce our dangerous carbon emissions 80% by 2050 and slow the warming of our planet. And we'll create 5 million new jobs in the process.
Which gave Todd Stern a few arguments during his visit to Paris to prepare future negotiations on climate change.
In Kyoto, the United States at the end didn't join, but also countries like China, India, Brazil, the big developing countries, also did not have any requirements to reduce their own emissions. We can't have that anymore. We need to have all of the major countries come into the agreement, work together, and start reducing their own emissions.
To implement its new policy on the environment, the Obama administration would be well advised to look towards Europe. The 27 European countries didn't stop, indeed, with the promises made in Kyoto. In 2008, and under the French presidency, Europe unilaterally decided to go even further and adopted the Energy Climate Package. Increase of 20% of sustainable energy sources, increase of 20% of energy savings, decrease of 20% of carbon dioxide emissions. But to succeed, we must first become aware of the real cost of our activities.
We have to indicate that there's a higher price on carbon than what people are paying in buying fossil fuels or whatever else is related to carbon dioxide emissions. And that's why if we want to move to a low carbon future, it's essential to see that we provide this price on carbon, which will lead to development of low carbon technologies and products and processes.
Brussels has finally set the real cost of carbon and is now implementing an impressive system of emission rights on 11,000 of the most polluting companies in Europe. Coal power plants, oil refineries, cement or paper industry, the companies in these sectors have been allocated quotas, and they will have to pay heavy fines if they exceed them. They can, however, decide to buy the quotas they are short of on the market. A few steps away from the Palais Brongniart, the Paris Stock Exchange, Blue Next is another type of stock exchange. The furniture is not all yet in place, but Serge Harry, CEO of Blue Next, intends to promote the image of his young company, the first carbon stock exchange in Europe. No dollars or equity at Blue Next. It is CO2 that is being sold and exchanged on the screens of its computers.
Je pense que pour bien comprendre l'activité de Blue Next, il faut revenir à l'engagement pris par l'Union européenne de demander aux 27 pays qui ont adhéré à la mesure de baisser leurs émissions de CO2 de 20% d'ici à l'horizon 2020. Alors pour baisser ces émissions, il y a deux engagements en fait. L'un, c'est de mettre un cap. Donc on va réduire progressivement le plafond d'émissions de chacune des entreprises des secteurs concernés. Et on va permettre aux entreprises qui font des efforts de réduction d'émissions de pouvoir négocier leur surplus d'émissions de CO2 sur un marché et donc de pouvoir le monnayer et peut-être utiliser cet argent pour faire des investissements qui diminuent les émissions de CO2. Blue Next est la bourse qui va permettre ces échanges de tonnes de carbone sur un marché.
Quotas were first allocated free of charge, but will soon come at a cost. And scarcity will make them more expensive. Companies which are lagging behind will have to join the effort, allowing the financing of new policies on CO2 savings by European countries.
Chaque pays, puisque ça va se faire pays par pays, chaque pays va pouvoir utiliser ses revenus tirés de la vente de ces quotas pour encourager des filières plus économes en émissions de CO2, des filières vertes, inciter certainement l'énergie solaire et d'autres énergies alternatives.
Europe may have found a way to transform its economy profoundly without damaging its industry in the process. After an hour's flight from the coast, Sleipner can at last be spotted on the horizon. Kai Lima manages the Statoil project and is now visiting one of the 32 Norwegian oil rigs in the North Sea. Sleipner T is one of his major prides. This is a strange outstation designed to capture the CO2 which comes out of an oil rig and to re-inject it into empty gas pockets at the bottom of the ocean. This world premiere makes it possible for the Norwegian petrol company to capture 1 million tons of CO2 every year and to make huge savings along the way. Throwing this back into the air would prove to be much more expensive indeed.
Norway, as the first nation in the world, introduced a CO2 emission tax back in '91. First of all, we did avoid a CO2 tax for each ton of CO2 we did inject. Secondly, we also have the environmental aspect.
We are in Stavanger, a city where children play their first games on old oil rigs recycled as playgrounds. This is where Statoil prepares for new projects. CO2 is here considered a new treasure, which needs to be exploited.
CO2 could be transported either by pipeline, just like gas or oil for that sake, and by vessels.
The solution could help us capture the carbon dioxide of some of the most polluting industrial sites.
Roughly 60% of man-made CO2 emissions are in fact coming from quite a few sources, from 6,000-7,000 huge point sources. And most of those sources could in fact be equipped with CO2 capture technology or capture facilities.
Europe takes this very seriously, but the capture of CO2 leaves Dr. Pochari skeptical.
While we certainly see the potential for carbon capture and storage, we feel that the technology is not quite ready to be commercialized on a large scale. Once we have enough assurance that some of the risks associated with CCS and the costs that are going to be incurred look more attractive, then certainly carbon capture and storage would be of great value, particularly for coal-based power generation.
For conclusions of such report.
Simply capturing CO2 will not be enough. The scientific community faces an urgent challenge, that of inventing and developing innovative solutions against global warming.
Dealing with issues of energy and environment, it's complex. But there is no solution without scientific progress and technological progress. That's why we believe that we would need increased funding and that we would need to deal with these issues together, joining the forces on European Union level.
A new society is slowly emerging with less carbon everywhere. Wind power, solar and photoelectric energy, bioenergy, nuclear fusion, the development of greener modes of transport, together with the capture and storage of CO2, all represent solutions for the future.
Of course, it's not only the energy production, it's also how we save the energy which we are producing. So you should look to all these questions in the short term and in the long term. In a short term, energy savings is the must. It's the only real, fast and clear answer.
Europe has engaged in a policy of energy saving in all areas. Regulations concerning new buildings, financial assistance for the renovation of old ones, bonus malus on cars, or implementation of the carbon tax. The race against time has started truly to change the behavior of individuals and their methods of production. For example, within the LVMH group, a symbol of French luxury, everything has changed in the recent years. From the manufacturing of raw materials to the management of waste, from the transport of products to the consumption of energy, all activities of the company are now scrutinized to evaluate their carbon impact.
Le grand intérêt, c'est que la cartographie des résultats obtenus est très claire. C'est-à-dire qu'on voit toujours les 2-3 endroits où effectivement on est émetteur de gaz à effet de serre, pas nécessairement sur nos sites de fabrication, mais par des choix qu'on a faits. Des choix de mode de transport, des gens ou des matériaux, des choix de bâtiments.
This warehouse is an example of environment-friendly architecture. Converting more than half its air freight to maritime transport, LVMH has also considerably reduced its packaging. Over 1,000 French companies have now completed their carbon assessment, a method drawn up by the French Environmental Agency, which will soon become the rule.
A priori, le bilan carbone peut s'appliquer à toutes les entreprises, non seulement les entreprises, mais aussi les territoires, les collectivités locales. Cela dit, c'est vrai que les entreprises qui sont dans le périmètre des permis d'émission, elles sont contrôlées, donc je dirais leur intérêt pour faire un bilan carbone peut paraître moindre, même si ça leur permettrait d'identifier des émissions en dehors de leur périmètre strict. Mais c'est vrai que ça concerne toutes les entreprises a priori.
This new mentality can have rather unexpected outcomes.
Ça réconcilie en même temps la personne à l'intérieur de l'entreprise, mais ça l'amène aussi à se poser des questions en tant que citoyen dans sa vie quotidienne. Et à partir du moment où on a vu, par exemple, à l'intérieur d'une entreprise, les émissions de gaz à effet de serre qui sont dues au transport, on se met à se poser ces questions de transport pour sa vie quotidienne.
Supported by the French Environmental Agency, one of the major French retailers decided to lead the way with an experiment. Eric Labouze is the manager of Biointelligence Service. The company will show on the label the environmental cost of each product we consume. More than 400 products in its range are now labelled with the quantity of CO2 produced by their manufacture, packaging and transport. This is in line with the scope of the French Grenelle Environment Roundtable, set up to consider how to start afresh.
L'objectif, c'est que le consommateur soit déjà informé, qu'il y a un signal qui se présente devant lui, que tous les produits qu'on met dans le caddie ont tous une empreinte environnementale et pas seulement les produits que l'on mange, hein, les produits, les vêtements, les produits d'entretien, tout ce que l'on consomme impacte le changement climatique.
450 grams of CO2 for this dessert, 360 grams for this one, whose ingredients haven't travelled for such a distance. All emissions taken into account, they represent 8 tonnes a year for a European, 2 tonnes for an Indian and 25 for an American. To curb the increase of temperatures, we should all limit ourselves to 3 tonnes a year.
L'acteur clé du système, ce n'est pas les industriels, ce n'est pas les réglementaires. L'acteur clé du système aujourd'hui, c'est le consommateur dans sa dimension citoyenne et c'est lui qui peut donner les signaux à l'industrie dont l'objectif, ce n'est pas de réduire les émissions de CO2, mais c'est de vendre et de générer du profit.
I would like to see a large-scale boycott of those products which are very high in carbon intensity and are supplied by companies who are not prepared to move. I think if people did that directly, that would send a very powerful message and companies will change. And governments will also realize that people want something which they have been neglecting all this while.
War against CO2 has been declared, but much more remains to be done, and fast.
We simply don't have time to rely on untested, unknown solutions when basically the opportunity to tackle climate change at cheapest cost is in the next 10 years, not in the next half a century or so. Europe has committed itself so far to a carbon dioxide emissions reduction target of 20% reductions by 2020. And they have said that they will increase that to 30% if there is a global deal. We feel that leadership would actually be committing to that target now in order to give confidence to other parts of the world that are less responsible for having caused climate change. Europe has a key role in trying to get this global agreement fully agreed. Historically, they have been the leaders, they have been the most progressive. And at the moment, they are not playing their full part. They are not leading.
Global warming forces us to become aware of the mistakes we have made in the past. By regarding the Earth's resources as infinite, we end up disturbing the fragile balance of life on our planet. Are we going to be capable of consuming less for a better life? Can we reduce our CO2 emissions? Coming here, at the foot of the Korok Glacier, may help us become aware that our world is changing in an irreversible way.
Es un poco ver los últimos vestigios de lo que queda del hielo. Es un poco, es la prensa, sí, el morbo, la prensa negra igual un poco. Es un poco morboso, como que se va a ir y tú vas a ir a verlo antes de que se vaya.
before we take really serious action, it may be that we need to see disasters happen. I mean, there's a history of that. You know, we start to get serious after something bad has already happened, not because somebody is predicting something. So I'm a little pessimistic on that.
My belief is that you really don't have, as they say, a silver bullet. There is no single solution. I think we have to do a large range of things. And I should also emphasize that it's not just technology that we have to change. We also have to change our lifestyles.
I am hopeful that we will avoid the worst. I would be surprised if we committed ritual suicide, especially when the opportunities to avoid doing so are so plentiful and so affordable. My worry is that we won't do so quickly enough. And so we will end up having to do so much more expensively. Probably, depending on what estimates you look at, a ballpark figure is something like for every 10 years of delay, the cost will roughly double.
Well, I'm actually very confident. And the reason for this is I see no technical obstacles. We have the technology to reduce our usage of energy and to produce alternative energy. We have the knowledge about how the climate is changing. We have a lot of good monitoring program in place. Of course, we could have more, but we have all the information we need, and there's no obstacles. The only thing is a political decision, of course, that is needed.
Well, for me, the issue of climate change is the defining issue of our age. In many ways that the Cold War was for the previous generation. This is something that we all will be affected by, whether we choose to address it or not. That's a fact. Tackling climate change, I believe, is also a means of essentially tackling that financial recession and protecting ourselves against future crises of that kind, and also protecting ourselves against fossil fuel insecurity, which will just become more and more of an issue.
Europe will exist as a green continent, or it will not exist. And the world will exist as a green-blue planet, or it will not exist.
It has to be people power that is going to make a difference. So people, every single individual has to be convinced that action is required in this area. And if they start showing their preference for what needs to be done, then politicians won't have a choice.